The flashing red and blue lights pierced the heavy fog of the Maryland highway, reflecting off the polished obsidian paint of a brand new Lexus LS. Behind the wheel sat a man who had dedicated his entire life to the law, only to find himself staring down the barrel of its most deeply flawed execution. He wasn't a thief, he wasn't a threat. But to the officer walking toward his window with a hand resting on his holster, he was just another target. It was a bitter, damp evening, the kind of night where the cold seemed to seep directly into your bones. The roads winding through the affluent Virginia countryside were slick with a persistent mist, illuminated only by the warm glow of sprawling estates hidden behind wrought iron gates and ancient oak trees. Elias Thorne loved this time of night. The quiet afforded him a rare sanctuary from the relentless intellectual demands of his daily life. For years, Elias had served as a justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. His mind was a labyrinth of constitutional precedents, dissenting opinions, and the heavy burden of shaping the nation's legal landscape. But tonight, he was not Justice Thorne. Tonight, he was simply a devoted husband running a mundane errand. His wife, Abigail, had developed a severe migraine, and her specific prescription had been called into the 24-hour pharmacy on Old Dominion Drive. Elias, wanting to let her rest in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, had tossed on a pair of comfortable, slightly faded gray sweatpants and a worn navy blue Georgetown Law hoodie from his days as a visiting professor. He had grabbed the keys to his newly purchased Lexus LS 500, a rare indulgence for a man who had spent decades driving sensible sedans, and slipped out into the night. The Lexus was a marvel of modern engineering, its cabin eerily silent, the heated leather soothing his stiff lower back. As he glided back toward his home in the exclusive neighborhood known as the Reserve, Elias let his mind drift. He was contemplating the nuances of a complex Fourth Amendment case currently sitting on his desk, a case regarding unlawful search and seizure. The irony of what was about to happen would later strike him with the force of a physical blow. A short distance behind him, a Fairfax County police cruiser sat idling in the shadow of a closed gas station. Inside were two officers, Harlan Crow and his rookie partner Riley Grant. Officer Harlan Crow was a veteran of the force, tightly wound, and harbored a cynical worldview shaped by years on patrol. He considered himself a proactive cop, a man who didn't wait for crimes to be reported but sniffed them out. His colleagues called him aggressive, his commanding officers called his arrest record impressive, but underneath the badge was a festering prejudice, a set of deeply ingrained biases that dictated who belonged in these wealthy zip codes and who didn't. Riley Grant, fresh out of the academy, was just trying to keep up. He drove the cruiser, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, desperately trying to absorb Crow's harsh street gospel. "Look at this," Crow suddenly grunted, leaning forward in the passenger seat and pointing a gloved finger at the windshield. Through the mist, the taillights of Elias's Lexus glowed a deep, rich crimson. It was moving exactly at the speed limit, navigating the winding road with flawless precision. "It's a Lexus LS 500, brand new," Grant observed, squinting. "Driving perfectly fine." "Too perfectly," Crow snapped. "Who drives exactly the limit on this stretch at this hour? Somebody who doesn't want to get pulled over. Pull up alongside him. I want to see the driver." Jenkins hesitated. "We don't have probable cause, Derek. They're just driving." "I said pull up," Crow barked, the authority in his voice leaving no room for argument. Grant accelerated. The police cruiser surged forward, its engine roaring into the quiet night until it pulled parallel to the Lexus in the left lane. Crow rolled down his window, ignoring the freezing rain hitting his face, and stared into the cabin of the luxury vehicle. Because Elias had the dashboard lights dimmed to reduce glare, the interior was mostly dark. However, as the cars passed beneath the amber glow of a street lamp, Crow got his look. He saw a black man, older but wearing a baggy hoodie with the hood pulled halfway up to block the draft, dressed in what looked to Crow like street clothes. In Crow's mind, the equation solved itself instantly, fueled by a toxic cocktail of racial profiling and arrogant certainty. A black man in a hoodie, driving an expensive luxury sedan, at night, in one of the wealthiest, predominantly white suburbs in America. "Stolen," Crow declared, rolling his window back up. "Drop back behind him and light him up." "Wait, what?" Grant asked, his heart rate spiking. "Derek, we haven't even run the plates yet." "Run them while we're stopping him," Crow ordered, his hand already reaching down to toggle the siren panel. "I know a car thief when I see one. The guy is tense, hands gripping the wheel tight, wearing a hoodie to hide his face. He probably jacked it from a driveway in Great Falls minutes ago. Hit the lights, Toby. Now." With a reluctant swallow, Grant flipped the switch. Inside the Lexus, the serene silence was shattered as the cabin was instantly flooded with a strobing, blinding kaleidoscope of red and blue light. Elias Thorne glanced in his rearview mirror. He felt a sudden lurch in his stomach. It was a visceral reaction, one that transcended his Ivy League education, his prestigious career, and his lifetime appointment to the highest court in the land. For a fleeting second, he wasn't a Supreme Court justice. He was just a black man in America, seeing police lights in his rearview mirror on a dark, lonely road. Taking a deep, stabilizing breath, Elias immediately engaged his turn signal, smoothly decelerated, and pulled the Lexus onto the wide shoulder of the road, placing the vehicle into park. Elias knew the unwritten rules of survival better than anyone. He had spent his early career as a public defender in Baltimore, representing countless young men who had ended up bruised, beaten, or worse during routine traffic stops. He systematically began to neutralize any perceived threat. He rolled down all four windows of the Lexus to show there was no one else in the car. He reached up and turned on the bright interior dome light, illuminating his face and his empty hands. Finally, he placed his hands firmly at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel, his fingers splayed so they were entirely visible. He did not reach for his glove compartment. He did not unbuckle his seatbelt. He waited. In the cruiser, Crow was already stepping out into the cold rain before the car was fully in park. He unhooked the leather retention strap on his holster, a subtle but aggressive escalation. "Derek, wait!" Grant called out frantically, typing the Lexus's license plate into the mobile data terminal. "The system is lagging. Give me a second to get the registration." "I've got the driver. Cover the passenger side," Crow commanded, slamming his door shut and marching toward the Lexus. His heavy boots crunched loudly on the wet gravel. He approached the driver's side slightly behind the B-pillar, a tactical position designed to keep him out of the driver's line of sight and give him the upper hand. Crow shined his heavy Maglite flashlight directly into the side mirror, blinding Elias before moving it to shine directly into Elias's eyes. "Turn the engine off," Crow commanded. The tone wasn't a request. It was a bark, dripping with inherent hostility. "Good evening, officer," Elias replied, his voice a rich, resonant baritone. It was the same voice that regularly commanded the attention of the brightest legal minds in the country, steady and unflappable. He reached forward slowly with one hand, pressed the push-to-start button to kill the engine, and immediately returned his hand to the wheel. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Crow demanded, keeping the blinding beam fixed on Elias's face. "And don't make any sudden movements." "The registration and insurance information are in the glove compartment on the passenger side," Elias explained calmly. "However, I must apologize. In my haste to pick up my wife's medication from the pharmacy, I left my wallet and my driver's license on my desk at home. I live just a short distance from here inside the reserve." Crow let out a sharp, mocking laugh. It was the laugh of a man whose biases had just been perfectly confirmed. "Left your wallet at home? Right, you expect me to believe you live in the reserve?" Elias's jaw tightened infinitesimally, but his voice remained perfectly measured. "I assure you, officer, I do. If you run the license plates, you will see the vehicle is registered to Elias Thorne. You can verify my identity through your dispatch database. I can provide my date of birth and social security number." "I don't want your social security number," Crow snapped, leaning closer to the window, the smell of cheap coffee and stale spearmint gum radiating from his breath. "I want to know whose car this really is, because guys dressed like you don't drive cars like this around here." The sheer audacity of the statement hung in the cold air. It was naked, undeniable profiling. "Officer," Elias said, his tone shifting. The warmth evaporated, replaced by the freezing, precise cadence of a judge addressing an unruly attorney. "I have informed you of my identity. I have informed you of the vehicle's registration. I am complying with your orders. I strongly suggest you return to your vehicle, run my plates, and verify the facts before you escalate this situation any further." Crow's face flushed red with sudden fury. He hated being spoken to with authority, especially by someone he had already deemed beneath him. He saw Elias's calm demeanor not as compliance, but as defiance. The articulate speech, the steady gaze, it infuriated him. "You don't tell me how to do my job, boy," Crow snarled, his hand resting aggressively on the butt of his sidearm. On the passenger side, Rookie Grant felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. He peered through the open window, his flashlight illuminating the immaculate interior of the car. There were no signs of forced entry. The ignition wasn't punched. The driver was an elderly man who spoke with the vocabulary of a college professor. Something was terribly wrong here. "Derek," Grant called out nervously over the roof of the car. "Hey man, let's just go run his info. It's fine." "Shut up, Toby," Crow shot back without taking his eyes off Elias. "Step out of the vehicle." Elias did not move. He knew the law. Under Pennsylvania versus Mims, a police officer can legally order a driver out of a vehicle during a lawful traffic stop. However, Elias also knew that this stop was predicated entirely on racial profiling, lacking any reasonable, articulable suspicion of a traffic violation or criminal activity. Still, resisting a physical order on a dark roadside was a death sentence. The courtroom, not the street, was the place to litigate this. "Officer," Elias said slowly, ensuring every word was enunciated perfectly, "I will step out of the vehicle. I am doing so under protest, and I am putting you on notice that you are detaining me without reasonable suspicion or probable cause. My hands are moving to unbuckle my seatbelt now." "I said get out!" Crow yelled, entirely losing his temper. Before Elias could even press the release button on his seatbelt, Crow reached through the open window, unlocked the door from the inside panel, and violently yanked the heavy driver's door open. The violence of the action jarred the heavy Lexus door on its hinges. Elias Thorne, a man who commanded the utmost respect from the President of the United States down to the lowest clerk in the federal judiciary, was grabbed by the shoulder of his Georgetown hoodie. "I am stepping out," Elias stated forcefully, pulling his shoulder back to break the officer's grip. He unclipped his seatbelt and swung his legs out of the vehicle, planting his feet on the wet asphalt. He stood up to his full height. At well over 6 feet, Elias was an imposing figure, broad-shouldered and straight-backed. Crow, who was barely average height, suddenly found himself having to look up. This physical disparity only fueled the officer's aggressive insecurity. "Turn around and face the car. Put your hands on the roof," Crow ordered, drawing his handcuffs from his belt. Elias complied, turning slowly and placing his palms flat against the cold, wet roof of his own vehicle. "Officer, I am asking you to call for a supervisor to respond to this scene immediately." "You don't get to ask for anything," Crow sneered. He kicked Elias's legs apart roughly, nearly causing the older man to slip on the slick road, and began an aggressive, invasive pat-down search of his sweatpants and hoodie. He found the small paper bag containing Abigail's prescription. "What's this, drugs?" Crow asked, snatching the bag and ripping it open. "It is blood pressure medication for my wife," Elias answered, his eyes fixed on the wet asphalt. His mind was categorizing every civil rights violation occurring in real time: unlawful detention, unlawful search, battery. Over by the cruiser, Grant had finally gotten the sluggish computer system to return the vehicle inquiry. His eyes widened in absolute horror as he read the screen. "Vehicle 2025, Lexus LS 500 owner Elias Thorne. Address 412 Magnolia Drive. The reserve status, clean/no warrant. Special flag, federal magistrate/judicial officer." Grant practically dropped his flashlight. He sprinted toward the front of the cruiser. Derek, stop right now." Crow was entirely deaf to reason. He grabbed Elias's left wrist, twisting it sharply behind the justice's back. "Officer Grant!" Elias called out, his voice cutting through the damp air, betraying no pain despite the severe strain on his rotator cuff. "I suggest you inform your partner of what you just read on your terminal." "I said shut your mouth!" Crow roared. He slammed the cold steel of the handcuff onto Elias's left wrist, ratcheting it down tightly. It pinched the skin, sending a sharp spike of pain up Elias's arm. Crow then grabbed the right arm, wrenching it backward, and secured the second cuff. The metallic click, click, click echoed loudly in the quiet night. "Derek, you idiot, let him go!" Grant yelled, finally reaching the side of the Lexus and grabbing Crow by the shoulder of his uniform. "The car is his. It's registered to Elias Thorne. He's clean." Crow violently shoved Grant's hand away. "Are you out of your mind, Toby? Look at him. You think this guy lives in a multi-million-dollar house? He probably broke in, found the keys, and stole the car from the driveway. Burglars wear hoodies. They don't carry ID. It's textbook." "The system flagged him, Derek," Grant pleaded, his voice cracking with panic. He was young, but he wasn't stupid. He knew a catastrophic mistake when he saw one. "There's a special federal flag on the plates." "Yeah, probably means the owner is someone important, which means this scumbag is going away for a long time for stealing it," Crow rationalized, completely blinded by his own prejudice. He spun Elias around to face him. Elias Thorne looked down at the officer. His wrists throbbed, his shoulders ached, and his clothes were soaked from the freezing rain. Yet his expression was completely devoid of fear. He looked at Officer Harlan Crow not with anger, but with the cold, clinical judgment of a man who held the power to destroy careers with a stroke of his pen. "You have made your decision, Officer Crow," Elias said, reading the man's name tag. His voice was terrifyingly calm, devoid of the frantic pleading Crow was accustomed to hearing from suspects. "You have placed me in handcuffs. You have formally detained me. I will no longer answer any of your questions. I invoke my right to remain silent, and I invoke my right to legal counsel." "Good," Crow spat, grabbing Elias by the bicep. "Saves me the trouble of listening to your lies." Crow marched the Supreme Court justice toward the back of the Fairfax County police cruiser. He opened the rear door and shoved Elias inside. Because Elias was tall and his hands were cuffed behind his back, he fell awkwardly onto the hard plastic bench, hitting his shoulder against the protective cage. Crow slammed the door shut, locking Elias inside the dark, cramped cage. Through the rain-streaked window, Elias watched Crow and Grant arguing fiercely on the shoulder of the road. Grant was waving his arms, pointing back at the computer terminal in the cruiser, looking absolutely sick. Crow was dismissing him, pointing aggressively at the Lexus, completely entrenched in his false narrative. Sitting alone in the dark, the flashing lights reflecting off the cage wire, Elias let out a slow, steady breath. The indignity of the situation burned in his chest, a fiery reminder of the systemic failures he had spent his entire life fighting to correct from the bench. He could have told them who he was, he could have shouted his title, demanded they look up his face on their phones, threatened them with the wrath of the Department of Justice. But as the handcuffs dug into his wrist, Elias realized something crucial. If this could happen to him, a man of immense privilege, education, and power, simply because he forgot his wallet while wearing a sweatshirt, it was happening to thousands of voiceless men every single day. Elias Thorne decided right then and there that he was not going to give Officer Crow the easy way out. He was not going to drop his title to save himself a night in jail. He was going to ride this out. He was going to let Crow process him, book him, and stand before a judge. He was going to expose the rot in the department in the most spectacular, undeniable way possible. The cruiser door opened and a fuming Crow slid into the driver's seat. Grant got into the passenger side, burying his face in his hands. "Dispatch, Car 4 Bravo," Crow said into his radio, his voice oozing with unearned triumph. "I'm 10-8 en route to the precinct with one adult male in custody, grand theft auto." Elias leaned his head back against the plastic seat, his eyes cold and hard in the darkness. "Drive, Officer Crow," he thought. "Drive straight into the storm." The drive to the Fairfax County Adult Detention Center took some time. For Officer Harlan Crow, it was a victory lap. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel in time with the faint beat of the classic rock station playing on the radio, occasionally casting a smug glance at the rearview mirror. Beside him, Rookie Riley Grant looked like a man being driven to his own execution. He had spent the entire ride covertly tapping on the mobile data terminal, trying to dig deeper into the federal magistrate/judicial officer flag on the Lexus's registration. Every database he accessed required a higher clearance level than a rookie patrolman possessed, spitting back red error messages that only deepened the pit in his stomach. In the back, Elias Thorne remained perfectly still. The handcuffs were exceptionally tight, cutting off the circulation to his thumbs. The cold rain had soaked through his Georgetown hoodie, chilling him to the bone. Yet his mind was razor sharp, cataloging every procedural error, every microaggression, every violation of the Constitution he had sworn an oath to protect. The cruiser pulled into the sally port of the detention center, the heavy steel garage doors ground shut behind them, sealing them in the harsh, fluorescent-lit concrete bunker. Crow got out, yanked the rear door open, and hauled Elias out by the arm. "Welcome to the real world, buddy. Let's go." They marched through a set of reinforced doors and into the chaotic hum of the booking area. The air smelled of industrial bleach, stale sweat, and despair. Telephones rang incessantly. Officers shouted over the din, processing a parade of drunk drivers, petty thieves, and belligerent locals. At the raised intake desk sat Sergeant Marcus Harlan, a veteran counting down the days to his pension. He barely looked up from his monitor as Crow approached, practically shoving Elias against the booking counter. "What do we got, Crow?" Harlan asked, stifling a yawn. "Grand theft auto. Caught him red-handed cruising down Old Dominion in a stolen Lexus LS. He's playing the silent game," Crow declared proudly. "Claims he left his ID at home. Probably doesn't want us finding out how many active warrants he's got." Harlan finally looked up, his bored eyes scanning Elias. He saw an older black man in wet sweatpants, a hoodie, and no shoelaces. Crow had forced him to remove them in the sally port. Out of context, stripped of his tailored suits and his black robe, Elias was processed not as a man of stature, but as a statistic. "Name?" Harlan asked, hovering his fingers over the keyboard. Elias looked directly at the sergeant. "My name is Elias Thorne. The vehicle I was driving is registered in my name. I am invoking my right to remain silent, and I am requesting my phone call to contact my attorney." Crow snorted loudly. "Yeah, he also claims he lives in a multi-million-dollar estate in the reserve. Put him down under the name on the registration for now, Sarge. We'll run his prints through AFIS and see who he really is. I guarantee you Elias Thorne is just the poor bastard he stole the car from." Grant stepped up to the counter, his voice trembling slightly. "Sergeant Harlan, sir, when I ran the plates, there was a federal flag on the registration. It said judicial officer. I think you should learn how to write an incident report, rookie," Crow interrupted, shooting Grant a venomous glare. "The flag means the owner of the car is a judge, which means this guy stole a judge's car. It makes the charge that much sweeter." Harlan sighed, rubbing his temples. He didn't have the energy for Crow's grandstanding or the rookie's anxiety. "All right, whatever. Empty your pockets, Carter. Take off the hoodie. Step over to the scanner for fingerprints." The dehumanization process was brutally efficient. Elias's wedding band, his watch, and his wife's medication were unceremoniously dumped into a plastic bin. He was forced to strip off the damp Georgetown hoodie, leaving him in a plain white undershirt that offered no protection against the freezing air conditioning of the jail. He was ushered to the live scan machine. The booking officer forcefully rolled Elias's thumbs and fingers across the glass plate. Elias complied with dead-eyed compliance. He knew exactly how long the automated fingerprint identification system took to return a hit. Next was the mugshot. Elias stood against the gray wall, staring into the lens of the camera. He did not scowl. He did not look away. He stared directly down the barrel of the lens with a look of absolute, terrifying authority. It was a gaze that had wilted seasoned appellate attorneys in the Supreme Court chamber, and it was forever immortalized in the Fairfax County Police database. Put him in cell block C, Harlan ordered, handing Crow a slip of paper. We'll wait for the prince to bounce back and assign him a public defender for the morning arraignment. Elias was led down a long, echoing corridor lined with heavy steel doors. The noise here was different, a cacophony of shouting, coughing, and the rattling of bars. Crow shoved him into a holding cell that already contained 2 men sleeping off a bender on narrow metal benches. Get comfortable, Crow mocked, pulling the heavy bar door shut with a deafening clang. You're not seeing the outside of a cell for a very long time. As Crow's footsteps faded down the hall, Elias stood in the center of the cramped, foul-smelling cell. He looked at the concrete walls, the exposed toilet, the men huddled in the corners. He had spent his life reading about these conditions in appellate briefs, debating the constitutionality of overcrowding and solitary confinement from the sterile comfort of his chambers. Now he was breathing it in. He walked to the corner, sat down on the cold floor, and waited. Later, an exhausted corrections officer finally unbolted the door to cell block C and called out, "Thorne, phone call. Let's go." Elias was led to a bank of heavy metal phones mounted to a cinder block wall in the corridor. He picked up the receiver. The plastic was greasy. He dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang 3 times before a frantic voice answered. "Elias, where are you? The police found your car abandoned on the side of Old Dominion. They came to the door asking if I was okay." "Abigail, breathe," Elias said, his voice a steady, calming anchor. "I am unharmed. I am currently at the Fairfax County Adult Detention Center." "The jail?" Abigail gasped, the panic spiking in her voice. "Elias, what happened? Did you get into an accident? Why do they have your car?" "I was pulled over by an officer who believed I stole my own vehicle," Elias explained simply. "I was arrested for grand theft auto." There was a stunned, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Abigail Thorne was a brilliant woman, a retired literature professor who understood the world perfectly. She didn't need him to explain the subtext. She knew exactly why a police officer looking at her husband in a hoodie wouldn't believe he owned a luxury car. When she spoke again, her voice had hardened into steel. "I'm calling the Chief Justice, I'm calling the Attorney General, I'm calling the Washington Post. I will have that department dismantled by sunrise." "Abigail, listen to me very carefully," Elias commanded, his tone dropping an octave. "You will do no such thing, not yet. If you make those calls, the chief of police will come down here, apologize profusely, release me quietly, and fire one racist cop to save face. The system will protect itself." "Elias, you have to be at the court for oral arguments." "I am aware of my docket, my love, but I need to see this through. I need this officer to stand up in a court of law and put his prejudice on the public record under oath. If they can do this to me, they are doing it to thousands of men who do not have our resources. I will not give them the out." He could hear her taking a deep, shuddering breath. "What do you need me to do?" "Call Arthur, tell him where I am, tell him to meet me at my morning arraignment, and Abigail." "Yes?" "Tell him to bring my suit, the charcoal one." Later, Elias used his second allotted call, a courtesy granted by a guard who was getting tired of looking at him, to dial Arthur Harlan. Arthur was not just a friend. He was one of the most ruthless and high-powered defense attorneys in Washington, D.C., a man whose retainer started at 6 figures. "This better be an emergency, Elias," Arthur groaned, his voice thick with sleep. "It's the middle of the night." "Arthur, I need you to represent me at an arraignment hearing in Fairfax County." There was rustling on the other end, followed by the sound of a lamp clicking on. "Elias, is that you? What the hell are you talking about? Arraignment for what?" "Grand theft auto, resisting an officer." Arthur let out a sound that was half laugh, half cough. "Elias, did you hit your head? You're a sitting Supreme Court justice. You don't steal cars." "An officer, Harlan Crow of the Fairfax County Police, seems to disagree," Elias said dryly. "Arthur, I need you there, but you must promise me you do not reveal who I am until we are in front of the judge. Let the prosecutor read the charges. Let the officer submit his sworn affidavit. Lock them into their narrative." Arthur Harlan was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, the sleep was entirely gone from his voice, replaced by the sharp, predatory excitement of a trial lawyer handed a nuclear weapon. "You're setting a trap." "I am allowing the Commonwealth of Virginia to proceed with their chosen course of action," Elias corrected mildly. "I will see you at the hearing, Arthur." Later that morning, the holding cells were emptied. The inmates were shackled together at the wrists and ankles, forming a long, clinking chain of human misery. Elias Thorne was placed squarely in the middle of the line. He was handed a bright orange, ill-fitting jumpsuit. He refused to wear it, remaining in his white undershirt and sweatpants, earning him a shove from a deputy. They were loaded onto a heavily armored bus and driven the short distance to the Fairfax County Courthouse. Inside Courtroom 3B, the atmosphere was a chaotic churn of municipal justice. It was an arraignment court, a machine designed to process dozens of human beings an hour. Public defenders ran back and forth with stacks of manila folders, whispering rapid-fire plea deals to defendants they had met 30 seconds prior. Presiding over the chaos was Judge Marcus Harlan. Harlan was a no-nonsense, fiercely intelligent jurist who had actually argued a case in front of the Supreme Court years earlier. He was currently rubbing his temples, exhausted by a docket of public intoxication and petty theft. Sitting in the first row of the gallery, completely out of uniform and wearing a smug, self-satisfied grin, was Officer Harlan Crow. He had stayed past the end of his shift, eager to watch the car thief get denied bail. Rookie Riley Grant was nowhere to be found, having taken a sick day immediately after his shift ended, paralyzed by impending doom. At the prosecutor's table sat Assistant District Attorney Elena Voss. She was young, overworked, and currently scanning the top sheet of a file labeled Commonwealth vs. Carter, John Doe alias. The side door opened and the bailiff led the chain of inmates into the jury box. Simultaneously, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. In walked Arthur Harlan. He was wearing a bespoke three-piece navy suit, carrying a genuine alligator skin briefcase and radiating an aura of wealth and power that instantly made the chaotic room feel inadequate. He walked past the gallery, completely ignoring Officer Crow, and approached the defense table. Ada Voss looked up, blinking in confusion at the legendary attorney standing across from her. Judge Harlan banged his gavel, his eyes landing on Arthur. "Mr. Harlan, what on earth brings you to my morning misdemeanor and arraignment docket? Are you lost?" "Not at all, Your Honor," Arthur smiled pleasantly, setting his briefcase down. "I am here to represent my client in the matter of the Commonwealth versus Carter." Harlan flipped through his massive binder, frowning. Carter, Grand Theft Auto. Resisting, the defendant refused to provide identification, so he's listed as a John Doe pending AFIS results. Harlan looked over at the jury box full of chained men. "Which one is your client, Mr. Harlan?" Arthur turned and looked at the jury box. He locked eyes with the man in the white undershirt sitting in the second row. "My client is the gentleman in the second row, Your Honor," Arthur said, his voice echoing perfectly in the suddenly quiet courtroom. "And he is not a John Doe. He has been telling the arresting officers exactly who he is since the moment he was pulled over." In the gallery, Officer Crow leaned forward, scoffing quietly. High-priced lawyer, Crow thought. The car thief must be part of an organized ring. Doesn't matter. I caught him dead to rights. "Bailiff, bring the defendant forward," Judge Harlan ordered. The bailiff unlocked Elias from the chain and led him to the defense table. Elias stood next to Arthur. Despite the lack of sleep, the lack of a suit, and the heavy metal shackles around his wrists and ankles, Elias stood with a terrifyingly rigid posture. Judge Harlan looked down from the bench. He adjusted his glasses. He looked at the charge sheet, then he looked back at the defendant. For 5 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the courtroom was the hum of the HVAC system. The color drained entirely from Judge Harlan's face. His jaw actually dropped, a deeply unprofessional reaction that he was entirely powerless to stop. He recognized the man standing in front of him. He had stood at a podium in Washington, D.C. and answered this man's piercing questions about appellate jurisdiction. "Good morning, Your Honor," Elias Thorne said quietly. Judge Harlan swallowed hard. "Gee, Justice Thorne, what is the meaning of this?" Behind the railing in the first row of the gallery, Officer Harlan Crow's smug smile vanished, replaced by a sudden, violent sensation of free fall. The silence in courtroom 3B was absolute, a heavy, suffocating vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen directly from Assistant District Attorney Elena Voss's lungs. She stared at the man in the white undershirt and shackles. She looked down at the charging document that labeled him John Doe. Then she looked back up at Judge Harlan, whose face was a mask of unadulterated horror. "Your Honor," Ada Voss stammered, her voice cracking so severely she sounded like a frightened child. The Commonwealth was not aware." "Not aware?" Judge Harlan's voice started low, a dangerous rumble that vibrated through the wooden bench. "Miss Voss, are you telling me that your office authorized the overnight detention and shackling of a sitting justice of the United States Supreme Court without verifying his identity?" "We relied on the arresting officer's report, Your Honor," she pleaded, physically backing away from her own table as if the file might explode. The affidavit stated the suspect refused to identify himself and exhibited hostile, evasive behavior consistent with Grand Theft Auto. Arthur Harlan stepped forward, the absolute master of the room. He didn't yell, he didn't need to. "Your Honor, my client provided his name, his address, and the location of his registration to Officer Harlan Crow within seconds of being unlawfully pulled over. Furthermore, the patrol cruiser's own mobile data terminal flagged the vehicle's registration as belonging to a federal judicial officer. Officer Crow willfully ignored this data, instructed his partner to ignore it, and proceeded to assault, handcuff, and cage my client based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the clothes on his back." In the gallery, Officer Harlan Crow felt his knees give out. He slumped back onto the wooden bench, his vision tunneling. The blood roared in his ears, a deafening waterfall of panic. "Supreme Court Justice." The words looped in his brain, devoid of meaning, too massive to comprehend. He had strip-searched a Supreme Court Justice. He had forced him to take his shoelaces out. He had called him boy. "Bailiff!" Judge Harlan roared, the sudden volume making half the courtroom jump. "Get those shackles off him this instant. If you make him take one more step in those chains, I will hold you in contempt." The bailiff sprinted across the well, his hands shaking so violently he dropped the key twice before finally unlocking the heavy iron cuffs around Elias's wrists and ankles. The heavy chains fell to the carpeted floor with a dull, heavy thud. Elias rubbed his raw, bruised wrists. He did not look relieved. He looked like a storm gathering off the coast. "Justice Thorne," Judge Harlan said, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound respect and deep shame, "I cannot begin to express the apologies of this court, this county, and the Commonwealth of Virginia. I am dismissing these charges immediately with extreme prejudice. You are free to go, sir. Please let me offer you my private chambers to rest." "Hold on, Your Honor," Arthur interjected smoothly. "Before the charges are formally dismissed, we have a piece of housekeeping regarding the sworn affidavit submitted to this court by Officer Crow." Arthur picked up a piece of paper from his alligator skin briefcase. Under penalty of perjury, Officer Crow wrote, "The suspect was driving erratically, matching the profile of recent auto thefts in the area. Upon approach, suspect refused to comply with lawful orders, made furtive movements toward the glove box, and physically resisted extraction from the vehicle." Arthur turned slowly, his eyes finding Crow cowering in the first row. "Every single word of this document is a fabricated lie designed to retroactively justify a racially motivated, unconstitutional seizure, and he swore to it in your court, Judge Harlan." Judge Harlan's eyes snapped to the gallery. The deference he had shown Elias vanished, replaced by the righteous fury of a judge who realized his courtroom was being used to launder a dirty cop's prejudices. "Officer Crow," Harlan commanded, pointing a trembling finger at the gallery, "stand up." Crow tried to stand, but his legs barely supported him. He gripped the wooden railing, his knuckles white, his face completely drained of blood. "Your Honor, I believed—" "You believed what?" Harlan interrupted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "That a black man in Virginia driving a nice car must be a criminal? You ignored a federal database flag. You falsified a sworn affidavit. You brought a malicious prosecution into my courtroom." "He was wearing a hoodie," Crow blurted out, a pathetic, reflexive defense that only highlighted the sheer absurdity of his prejudice. "He didn't have his wallet. It was standard police work. Your Honor, I was protecting the neighborhood." "You were protecting your own ego, officer." Elias Thorne's voice finally broke through the room. The entire courtroom froze. When a Supreme Court justice speaks, the world listens, even in a white undershirt and sweatpants. Elias commanded the space effortlessly. He stepped past his defense table, walking directly to the wooden railing that separated the well from the gallery, stopping just a short distance away from the trembling police officer. "You speak of standard police work," Elias said, his baritone voice calm, measured, and utterly devastating. "Standard police work requires reasonable, articulable suspicion under Terry v. Ohio. You had none. It requires probable cause for an arrest under the Fourth Amendment. You had none. You looked at me and you saw a caricature. You saw a threat where none existed and a criminal where there was only a citizen." Elias leaned in slightly. "I survived last night because I know the law better than you do and because I have the resources to summon Arthur Harlan at 3 in the morning. But what about the young man who doesn't? What about the teenager driving home from a late shift who gets pulled over by you? What happens when he gets terrified? What happens when he asks you why he's being stopped? Do you drag him from his car? Do you put your knee on his neck?" Crow opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was a bully, stripped of his badge, shrinking under the unbearable weight of his own actions. "Your Honor," Elias said, turning back to Judge Harlan, "I accept the dismissal of the charges, but I ask that the transcript of this hearing be forwarded directly to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and to the Virginia State Police Internal Affairs Bureau." "It will be sent before noon, Justice Thorne," Harlan promised, "along with my personal recommendation for an investigation into perjury." Arthur handed Elias his briefcase. "Let's go, Elias. You have oral arguments in 90 minutes. With a final lingering look at the shattered police officer, Elias Thorne turned and walked out of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind him, leaving a profound, suffocating silence in their wake. In the quiet sanctuary of Judge Harlan's private chambers, Elias finally stripped off the damp, foul-smelling undershirt. Abigail had sent Arthur with his charcoal gray Brooks Brothers suit, a crisp white shirt, and his favorite crimson silk tie. As Elias knotted his tie in the mirror, he looked at his wrists. The metal cuffs had left deep, angry purple bruises circling the bone. He could easily cover them by unbuttoning his cuffs and letting the sleeves hang low. Instead, he adjusted his gold cufflinks tightly, ensuring the cuffs sat high on his wrists. The bruises would be visible. Let them see. Later that morning, the Marshal of the Supreme Court banged the gavel in the grand marble-columned chamber in Washington, D.C. "Oh yes! Oh yes! Oh yes! All persons having business before the Honorable the Supreme Court of the United States are admonished to draw near and give their attention, for the court is now sitting." Justice Elias Thorne emerged from the red velvet curtains alongside his 8 colleagues. He took his seat at the massive mahogany bench. To the attorney standing at the podium, he looked exactly as he always did, an impenetrable fortress of legal intellect. But as he reached for his glass of water, the bruising on his wrist caught the light. The Chief Justice, sitting to his right, noticed them immediately, his eyes widening in silent, alarmed question. Elias merely gave a subtle shake of his head. The work came first. By midday, the story broke. It did not leak from the Supreme Court. It exploded out of the Fairfax County Courthouse. Dozens of inmates, public defenders, and clerks had witnessed the arraignment. The Washington Post ran the digital headline, Supreme Court Justice arrested, shackled in Virginia traffic stop, officer accused of racial profiling. The fallout was a Category 5 political hurricane. The system, which usually moved with agonizing slowness when dealing with police misconduct, suddenly operated at the speed of light. By early afternoon, the mayor and the Fairfax County police chief held a joint press conference, both looking physically ill. They announced the immediate termination of Officer Harlan Crow, effective retroactively. There would be no paid administrative leave. There would be no union protection. The police chief announced his own early retirement in the very next breath. But Elias was not satisfied with the firing. Firing was administrative. Elias wanted justice. Later, the Department of Justice announced a federal civil rights indictment against Harlan Crow under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. The swiftness of the indictment was unprecedented, fueled entirely by the undeniable, perfectly documented trap Elias had set by forcing the arrest all the way to arraignment. The star witness for the federal prosecution was not Elias Thorne, it was Officer Riley Grant. Grant had resigned from the Fairfax County Police Department the morning after the arrest. He had driven to the FBI field office in Washington, D.C., and handed over his personal notes, the cruiser's dash cam footage, and his own sworn testimony that Crow had explicitly ignored the federal database flag and used racial slurs to describe the driver. Later, as winter settled over Washington, Elias Thorne sat in his private chambers at the Supreme Court. He was drafting a majority opinion on a complex Fourth Amendment case involving qualified immunity for law enforcement. His fingers flew across the keyboard, his mind sharp, his purpose renewed. There was a soft knock on his door. His clerk leaned in. "Justice Thorne, there is a young man here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says his name is Riley Grant. He says it's important." Elias stopped typing. He looked at the bruises on his wrist, which had faded to a dull yellow. "Send him in." Riley Grant walked into the cavernous, wood-paneled office, looking like a man carrying the weight of the world. He was out of uniform, wearing a simple button-down shirt. He stood awkwardly in front of the massive desk, unable to meet the justice's eyes. "Mr. Grant," Elias said, gesturing to a leather armchair, "please sit." Grant sat on the edge of the seat. "Justice Thorne, I didn't come to ask for forgiveness. I just needed to look you in the eye and tell you that I am sorry. I was driving that car. I turned on the lights. I stood there and watched him put you in cuffs, and I didn't physically stop him. I was a coward." Elias studied the young man. He saw the guilt tearing him apart. "You were a rookie, Mr. Grant, trapped in a vehicle with a veteran officer who held your career in his hands," Elias said softly. "Fear is a powerful silencer. But courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is what you did the next morning when you walked into the FBI building and handed over the evidence that dismantled his lies." Grant looked up, tears brimming in his eyes. "I quit the force. I couldn't be part of it anymore." "That is a tragedy," Elias replied firmly, "because the only way that system changes is if men with your conscience stay inside it and fight the rot. We do not need fewer Riley Grants on the street. We need thousands more of you, men who will look at the mobile data terminal and refuse to back down." Elias opened his desk drawer and pulled out a heavy cream-colored envelope bearing the golden seal of the Supreme Court. He slid it across the desk. "Inside is a letter of recommendation written and signed by me," Elias said. "It is addressed to the director of the FBI Academy in Quantico. They are looking for agents who understand that the law applies equally to the men who enforce it. I suggest you apply." Grant stared at the envelope, his hands trembling as he reached out to take it. It was not just a career lifeline, it was absolution. "Thank you, sir," Grant whispered. "Do not thank me, Riley," Elias Thorne said, turning his chair to look out the massive window at the dome of the United States Capitol standing brilliant white against the gray winter sky. "Just make sure the next time you see someone standing on the edge of reason, you are the one who pulls them back. The law was flawed. The men who enforced it were fallible. But as long as there were people willing to endure the fire to expose the truth, the arc of the moral universe, no matter how slowly it bent, would always point toward justice. If this story opened your eyes to the realities of power, prejudice, and the pursuit of true justice, don't let the conversation end here. Click the like button to show your support for stories that matter. Share this video with your friends and family to spark an important debate, and hit subscribe with the notification bell turned on so you never miss our next deep dive into the incredible true stories that shape our world. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were in Justice Thorne's shoes? Let's talk about it.